The secret Spain won't put in law books. The palace is silent before dawn. Stone holds the cold of centuries. Flags hang without movement, not because there is no wind, but because this place was built to resist it. Spain does not announce its power loudly. It never has. Its strength is not found in proclamations, but in what is quietly understood by those who inherit responsibility rather than seek it. There are laws here, volumes of them, carefully codified, debated, amended, defended. They govern budgets, borders, rights, and offices. But the rule that has kept the Spanish state intact through collapse, restoration, exile, and return is not among them. It never could be. This is not a story about a person. It is a story about continuity. About an institution that learned, painfully, that survival depends on knowing which truths must never be written down. Spain's modern democracy rests on a constitution that names a crown, defines succession, and binds monarchy to popular sovereignty. On paper, it is precise. On paper, it is complete. But paper has limits. Because once a rule is written, it can be tested. Once it is tested, it can be weakened. And once it is weakened, the institution it protects becomes negotiable. So Spain protects its most important rule by never naming it. At first glance, the monarchy appears ceremonial. A constitutional symbol, a stabilizing presence, a visible reminder of continuity rather than a source of power. That is what most observers believe. It is what foreign chancelleries repeat. It is what legal scholars teach. But that understanding is incomplete. Because continuity here is not abstract. It is embodied in visible presence. And presence carries expectations no law can safely define. Here is the first truth that unsettles comfortable assumptions. The crown does not merely follow the Constitution. The Constitution quietly assumes the crown will behave in ways it cannot command. That assumption is the unwritten rule. By the second minute, the listener begins to sense the contradiction. Spain insists it is a modern republic in all but name. Yet it entrusts its deepest stability to a figure who must never behave like one. This is the living thread of continuity. History explains why. Spain has experienced the vacuum that appears when symbols fracture. Civil war taught it how quickly legality dissolves when legitimacy collapses. Dictatorship taught it how dangerous permanence becomes when continuity is forced rather than earned. When democracy returned, Spain chose restraint over certainty. It restored the crown not as a ruler, but as a referee. Not as a decision-maker, but as a guarantor that decisions would continue to be accepted even when they hurt. But referees only work if everyone agrees to the same invisible rules. And that agreement was never signed. At minute 2, the first cliff edge appears quietly. What happens if the crown behaves in a way that is legal, but destabilizing? No article answers that question. No court wants to, because the crown's true duty is not obedience. It is judgment, judgment exercised invisibly, predictably, and always in favor of institutional survival. This is why silence matters. The unwritten rule is not secrecy for its own sake. It is strategic ambiguity, a deliberate refusal to bind the future with language that could fail under pressure. By minute 5, the phrase must be spoken again, because repetition is how authority settles into memory. Spain's monarchy survives because everyone inside the system knows exactly what it means, without ever agreeing on words. It means the crown must never surprise the nation. It must never polarize it. It must never be seen choosing sides in conflicts that define identity, territory, or legitimacy. And above all, it must never appear optional. Here, national identity is woven into ritual. Ceremonies are not pageantry, they are stress tests. Every appearance, every speech, every silence is calibrated not for applause, but for continuity. This is why moments that seem personal are never treated that way internally. Private life ends where symbolic consequence begins. The deeper mystery, emerging around minute 8, is not whether this rule exists, but how long it can survive exposure. Modern Spain is transparent by design. Media scrutiny is constant. Public trust is conditional. Institutions are expected to explain themselves. But this institution cannot explain its core operating principle without undermining it. That tension is not resolved. It is managed. International observers notice this, even when they do not name it. In the United States, stability is measured by resilience under challenge. The question asked quietly is whether Spain's system can absorb shock without improvisation. In the United Kingdom, where unwritten rules also govern a crown, there is recognition rather than curiosity. They understand the danger of spelling out what must remain intuitive. Canada and Australia watch from systems that inherited monarchy without inheriting its original trauma. They study Spain as a case of adaptation rather than tradition. Germany, shaped by constitutional rigor, views the arrangement with caution, aware that ambiguity can stabilize but also conceal fault lines. None of these perspectives are wrong. None are complete. Because Spain's unwritten rule is not about monarchy alone. It is about what happens when a nation decides that its survival depends on leaving one question unanswered. At the midpoint, around minute 10, the escalation becomes unavoidable. The rule worked because those bound by it accepted its limits without testing them. But every generation tests boundaries simply by arriving. The future does not inherit silence automatically. It questions it. Here lies the institutional strain. The Constitution defines succession, but the unwritten rule defines legitimacy. And legitimacy is not transferable by document. The crown must embody continuity before it can symbolize it. This is why preparation is not optional. It is existential. Spain's legal framework can survive amendment. Its symbolic framework cannot survive improvisation. At minute 14, the point of no return is reached rhetorically, not with scandal, but with inevitability. A moment will come when silence is interpreted as evasion rather than restraint. When neutrality is misread as absence. When continuity is mistaken for inertia. When that happens, the unwritten rule will face its greatest test, not from rebellion but from misunderstanding. The institution knows this. That is why everything moves slowly. Why transitions are deliberate. Why visibility is carefully rationed. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And presence must always appear earned. By minute 19, the future threat can be named without panic. It is not abolition, it is dilution. A crown can survive criticism. What it cannot survive is becoming irrelevant while remaining visible. Global partners watch for signs not of collapse, but of drift. Because drift suggests loss of internal consensus. And loss of consensus is what turns unwritten rules into liabilities. The final return approaches quietly. It is spoken one last time not as a warning, but as a question. How long can a nation rely on what it refuses to define? How long can continuity be protected by silence in an age that demands explanation? Spain stands where it has stood before, between memory and adaptation. Between clarity and discretion. Between the safety of the written word and the power of what is understood without it. The law books remain unchanged. The rule remains absent from their pages. And history waits to see whether that absence is wisdom, or the last luxury of an institution that has always survived by knowing when not to speak. The silence does not end when the ceremony concludes. It deepens. Because the unwritten rule does not govern moments of stability. It governs moments of strain, when the system is asked to reveal what it truly values. Spain learned long ago that institutions rarely collapse from open attack. They erode from internal contradiction. From saying one thing while depending on another. The crown exists inside that contradiction by design. On paper, sovereignty flows from the people. In practice, legitimacy must feel continuous to be accepted. Elections reset authority. Symbols prevent it from shattering. This balance is fragile, and fragility demands discipline. What is never stated, but always enforced, is that the crown must remain ahead of public emotion and behind public will at the same time. Visible enough to anchor the state. Distant enough to avoid competing with it. That tension explains decisions that appear cautious to outsiders. It explains delays. It explains silences that seem excessive until history reminds Spain what happens when symbols move faster than consensus. The unwritten rule is not obedience to law. It is obedience to time. Every gesture is measured against memory. Every appearance weighed against what it might normalize. Every absence calibrated against what it might suggest. This is why succession here is not merely biological or legal. It is pedagogical. Continuity is taught before it is assumed. Responsibility is rehearsed long before it is exercised. Because the crown is not allowed to learn in public. That expectation is nowhere written. Yet it governs everything. The system depends on a shared understanding that certain mistakes cannot be made, not because they are illegal but because they are irreversible. As the years advance, pressure does not arrive dramatically. It accumulates. Transparency campaigns grow louder. Calls for modernization become more precise. Questions once asked only in private are now spoken openly. Each question chips at ambiguity. And ambiguity is the crown's shield. This is the paradox Spain must manage. To remain credible, the institution must be seen. To remain stable, it must not be explained too much. Foreign governments sense this balance instinctively. The United States evaluates whether Spain's continuity mechanisms can endure generational change without disruption. The United Kingdom recognizes the danger of saying aloud what only tradition can sustain. Canada and Australia observe how symbolism adapts when history is not shared equally by all citizens. Germany watches for signs that ambiguity might slip into uncertainty. These are not judgments, they are calibrations. Because institutional confidence is contagious, and so is doubt. What follows is not a prediction. It is an unresolved equation. If the unwritten rule holds, it will be because restraint continues to be valued over reaction. Because preparation remains invisible. Because continuity is allowed to feel boring. If it fails, it will not fail loudly. It will fail quietly, through over-clarification, over-exposure, over-explanation. The crown will not fall by defiance. It would fall by becoming ordinary. And so Spain continues forward as it always has. Not by declaring its most powerful rule, but by living as if everyone already understands it. The law books remain unchanged. The silence remains deliberate. And the future, as ever, waits to see whether what is unspoken can still hold what is to come. The final measure of power is not command. It is restraint. Spain's most enduring safeguard has never been written because writing it would imply doubt. And doubt, once acknowledged, becomes contagious. The unwritten rule endures because it asks something rarer than loyalty. It asks for discipline without enforcement, for obedience without instruction, for continuity without reassurance. This is why the institution moves carefully when the world demands speed. Why it answers pressure with patience. Why it allows ambiguity to do the work that certainty cannot. Here, continuity is not maintained by force or fear. It is maintained by shared understanding, quiet, persistent, and unforgiving of error. The danger ahead is not confrontation. It is explanation. Once the rule is spoken too clearly, it ceases to protect. Once it is defended openly, it invites challenge. Once it is simplified, it becomes fragile. This is the paradox Spain must continue to live with. To survive, the institution must be visible. To remain legitimate, it must never feel negotiable. And to remain negotiable in law, it must feel inevitable in practice. So the silence remains, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying it would change everything. The law books stay closed on this question. The rituals continue. The appearances are measured. The absences are intentional. And history moves forward, not with certainty, but with watchfulness. Because Spain's future does not hinge on whether its rules are updated. It hinges on whether the one rule that cannot be written can still be understood, without ever being named. The story does not end here. It pauses, exactly where institutions are most vulnerable and most alive.